Imagine this. World War III erupts across the planet. Missiles are flying, armies are mobilizing, and the entire global order is collapsing into chaos. The United States and its allies are locked in a desperate struggle with Russia, with battlefields spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. But here's the thing that changes everything. China, the country everyone assumed would be Russia's ace in the hole, the sleeping dragon that would tip the scales, suddenly says, nah, we're sitting this one out. No joke, the second most powerful military on Earth just refuses to play the game. Sounds insane, right? But what if China's refusal to join World War III doesn't prevent catastrophe? What if it actually makes everything more unpredictable, more dangerous, and way more complicated than anyone could have imagined? So let's set the stage here. Russia has pushed into NATO territory, maybe through the Baltics, or maybe through a massive escalation in Ukraine that spiraled out of control. Poland, Germany, and the UK are mobilizing everything they've got. American forces are pouring into Europe while simultaneously trying to maintain a presence in the Pacific. Because honestly, they've been preparing for a two-front war for decades. North Korea, always looking for an opportunity, starts making aggressive moves on the Korean peninsula. Iran sees its chance and things heat up catastrophically in the Middle East. This is the nightmare scenario every defense planner has been dreading. And everyone's got their eyes on Beijing, waiting to see which way the dragon moves. But then China does something that literally nobody saw coming. They declare neutrality. Complete, total, genuine neutrality. President Xi goes on television and basically says China will not participate in this conflict on any side. They're closing their borders to military operations, suspending all military aid to Russia, and positioning themselves as a neutral power focused solely on protecting their own territory and economic interests. The entire world just stops and goes, wait, what? Because here's the thing. China and Russia have been getting cozy for years. They've done joint military exercises. They've built economic partnerships specifically designed to counter Western influence, and everyone just assumed that when push came to shove, they'd have each other's backs. But real talk, China just looked at World War III and said, this ain't it, chief. So what happens next is where things get absolutely wild. Russia, who's been counting on Chinese support, even if just economic and diplomatic, suddenly realizes they're way more isolated than they thought. Sure, they've got Belarus, maybe some Central Asian states who are low-key terrified of them, and potentially Iran and North Korea, but China was supposed to be the game changer. Chinese manufacturing was supposed to keep their war machine running when Western sanctions tried to strangle their economy. Chinese diplomatic cover at the UN was supposed to prevent total international isolation. And there was always that implicit threat that if things went really badly for Russia, China might jump in and force NATO into a two-front nightmare. All of that just evaporated. The Russian economy, which was already going to take a massive hit from Western sanctions, now faces an even darker reality. China isn't buying their oil and gas at previous levels because they don't want to be seen as helping a combatant and risk their own economic relationships with the West. Those pipelines that Russia built specifically to pivot away from European markets, still flowing, but at reduced capacity and with China demanding absolutely insane discounts because they know Russia is desperate. We're talking 30, 40, maybe 50% below market rates. Russia's basically selling their natural resources for pennies on the dollar just to keep some revenue flowing, and China's just coldly maximizing their advantage. It's economic warfare without firing a single shot. But here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, kind of terrifying. With China sitting out, the United States and NATO can actually redirect forces. Remember, the Pentagon has been planning for decades on the assumption that a major conflict would require fighting Russia and China simultaneously. Entire carrier strike groups were positioned in the Pacific specifically to counter China. Advanced stealth bombers, submarines, cyber warfare units, all of this was split between two potential theaters. But now all of that can focus on Russia and its allies. Within weeks, you'd see American forces that were stationed in Japan, Guam, and South Korea getting redeployed to Europe and the Middle East. The military balance just shifted dramatically, and not in Russia's favor. The air war over Eastern Europe intensifies in ways that would have been impossible if the US was worried about defending Taiwan simultaneously. American F-35s, B-2 Spirit bombers, and next-generation drones start absolutely dominating the skies because they can commit resources they were holding back. Russia's air defense systems, which are legitimately impressive, start getting overwhelmed by sheer numbers and technological superiority. Naval operations in the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the North Atlantic see massive NATO reinforcement. Russian submarines, which are seriously advanced pieces of military hardware, find themselves hunted by American attack subs that would have been prowling the South China Sea in any other scenario. And look, this doesn't mean NATO just rolls over Russia in a few weeks. Russia's military is still formidable. They've got home field advantage, and they possess the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. But the resource allocation shift is massive. Every advanced weapons system, every elite unit, every ounce of American military might that was hedge betting on a Pacific conflict can now focus entirely on the European and Middle Eastern theaters. The war's still brutal, it's still devastating, but the trajectory changes significantly. Now let's talk about what's happening in Asia, because it gets seriously complicated. North Korea was probably expecting Chinese backing if they made moves on South Korea, kind of like a everyone's distracted, let's settle old scores situation. But with China refusing to participate and explicitly declaring neutrality, North Korea suddenly looks around and realizes they're on their own. Kim Jong-un might be unpredictable, but he's not completely suicidal. Without guaranteed Chinese support, any North Korean aggression becomes exponentially riskier. They've got nukes, sure, but actually using them without a powerful ally backing them up is basically national suicide. So instead of the Korean peninsula erupting into warfare like everyone feared, you might actually see North Korea backing down, maybe even using the crisis to negotiate, which honestly would be one of the most unexpected outcomes of this entire scenario. Japan and South Korea, who were preparing for the worst, suddenly find themselves in a much more secure position. They can actually contribute forces to support NATO operations or focus on ensuring regional stability without facing an immediate Chinese threat. Australia, same deal. The entire Indo-Pacific alliance structure that America's built over decades doesn't have to immediately activate for existential defense. This frees up not just American forces, but allied forces across Asia to potentially support operations elsewhere, or at minimum, not require desperate American protection. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. China's neutrality might actually make the nuclear risk higher in some ways. Stay with me here. One of the deterrents to nuclear escalation in any World War III scenario is that everyone with nukes knows that if one starts flying, everyone else is getting involved, and civilization basically ends. But with China sitting out and explicitly declaring they won't retaliate unless directly attacked, there's suddenly this weird gap in the deterrence architecture. Russia might start thinking, if we're losing badly enough, could we use tactical nukes in Europe without triggering Chinese involvement and total global annihilation? It's a horrifying calculation. But that's the kind of twisted logic that emerges when traditional power structures get disrupted. The economic consequences globally are legitimately insane. The world economy was already going to tank with World War III happening, but China's neutrality creates this bizarre situation where they become even more economically powerful by default. They're not spending resources on warfare, they're not getting bombed, their manufacturing base is intact, and suddenly they're the only major economy that's still fully functioning. Countries that need goods, that need trade, that need some semblance of economic stability, they're all turning to China. Beijing basically becomes the world's economic safe haven while everyone else is destroying each other. Chinese companies start buying up assets across the globe for pennies on the dollar. European companies devastated by war, Chinese investment, Russian companies desperate for cash, Chinese buyouts, even American companies struggling because half the economy is now defense-focused, Chinese capital starts flowing in. Within a year or two, China's economic influence expands dramatically. Not through military conquest, but literally by standing aside and letting everyone else weaken themselves. It's honestly one of the most brilliant geopolitical moves imaginable if they can pull it off without getting dragged in. The United Nations becomes completely paralyzed, but in new ways. Russia and China both have Security Council vetoes, but now China's actually using theirs to prevent any resolutions that would expand the war or justify broader intervention. They're blocking stuff that Russia wants and blocking stuff that NATO wants. Beijing positions itself as the voice of peace, calling for immediate ceasefires, negotiations, and diplomatic solutions. Whether they're sincere or just maximizing their advantage is honestly irrelevant. They're shaping the international narrative in ways that boost their prestige while everyone else looks like warmongers. Back on the battlefield, Russia's situation keeps deteriorating. Without Chinese manufacturing, they can't replace losses at the rate they need to. Tanks, aircraft, precision munitions, all of this requires components and raw materials that Russia either can't produce domestically in sufficient quantities or can't produce at all. They're stripping equipment from reserves that date back to Soviet times. You'd see T-55 tanks from the 1950s getting pulled out of storage, not because Russia wants to use obsolete equipment, but because they literally have no choice. The technological gap between NATO and Russian forces grows wider with every passing month. The Middle East situation spirals in unexpected directions. Iran, who probably jumped into the conflict expecting Russian support and assuming China would keep the US distracted in Asia, suddenly finds itself way more exposed. Israel, no longer worried about Chinese involvement complicating the strategic picture, coordinates with the US and Gulf allies to conduct extensive operations against Iranian nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. Turkey, always playing both sides, sees an opportunity to expand influence while everyone else is distracted. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are making their own calculations. The entire region's power dynamics shift rapidly, and honestly, it might end up looking completely different by the time the war ends. Africa becomes a major battleground for influence, but not military, economic and diplomatic. China's pouring resources into African nations, offering reconstruction aid, infrastructure deals, and positioning themselves as the partner who doesn't bring war to your doorstep. Meanwhile, Western powers are too stretched to maintain their traditional influence operations. Russia's losing access to African resources and mercenary recruitment grounds. The entire continent's alignment could shift dramatically in just a few years, with China emerging as the dominant external power basically by default. For regular people, life in China actually becomes relatively more stable compared to the rest of the world, at least in the short term. Yeah, the global economy crashing affects everyone, and Chinese exports drop significantly because nobody's buying stuff during a world war, but they're not dealing with bombs, refugees, or military conscription. College students in Beijing are worried about economic prospects, not whether their city's going to get hit by missiles. That's a massive difference. Meanwhile, Russians are dealing with total war mobilization and enormous casualties. Europeans are experiencing warfare on their soil for the first time since 1945. Americans are dealing with a draft, massive military deployments, and an economy completely oriented toward warfare. The contrast is stark. India, by the way, is watching all of this and making its own calculations. They've traditionally been non-aligned. They've got their own issues with China, but they also see an opportunity. With China neutral and Russia weakened, India could emerge as the other major Asian power. They might offer limited support to the West while maintaining relationships with Russia for weapon systems, basically playing all sides to maximize their position. It's the kind of complex diplomacy that India is actually pretty good at, and they come out of this scenario potentially much stronger. The intelligence war gets absolutely wild. Chinese intelligence services, without the distraction of being combatants, can focus entirely on collecting information on everyone else. They're watching Russian military performance, analyzing NATO tactics and technology, observing everything and learning from everyone else's mistakes. When this war eventually ends, China's military planning will incorporate lessons learned from the largest conflict since World War II without having lost a single soldier or piece of equipment. That's an incredible strategic advantage. And here's something most people don't think about: space and cyber warfare. China's been investing heavily in both, and with neutrality, they can continue developing these capabilities while everyone else is focused on shooting at each other. They could emerge from World War III with the most advanced satellite network, the most sophisticated cyber capabilities, and potentially anti-satellite weapons that nobody else can match because everyone else stopped developing them to focus on more immediate threats. The post-war balance of power in these domains could be completely in China's favor. Eventually, the war has to end. Russia, weakened and isolated, facing a resource-rich and focused NATO, probably can't achieve anything resembling victory. Maybe there's a negotiated settlement. Maybe there's a coup in Moscow. Maybe nuclear weapons get used in some limited way that doesn't end civilization but changes everything. However it ends, China emerges as the only major power that's relatively intact. They've got a functioning economy, a complete military that's learned valuable lessons without fighting, diplomatic relationships across the globe, and they've positioned themselves as the voice of reason and peace throughout the conflict. The post-war world order would be radically different. America and Europe are exhausted, economically devastated, and dealing with reconstruction. Russia's either completely collapsed or barely functioning as a state, and China's standing there relatively untouched with the world's largest economy by a significant margin, the most modern military that actually hasn't been tested or depleted, and enormous leverage over global trade and diplomacy. They didn't fire a shot, but they won the war by refusing to fight it. The irony here is absolutely insane. For decades, Western strategists warned about the China-Russia partnership being the biggest threat to global security. The nightmare scenario was always these two massive powers combining forces to challenge American hegemony. But what if the real nightmare was actually China being smart enough to sit out and let everyone else destroy each other? What if neutrality, not alliance, was always their best strategic option? This scenario reveals something fundamental about power in the 21st century. Military strength still matters, obviously, but economic resilience, strategic patience, and the willingness to let others make mistakes might matter even more. China refusing to join World War III wouldn't prevent the catastrophe of global conflict, but it would fundamentally alter who emerges victorious from the ashes. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying outcome of all, not the war itself, but the cold calculation of a power that understands victory sometimes means refusing to fight,